Bitterroot Valley, Montana, October 1907. The air, already sharp with the coming frost, carried the scent of pine resin and the clean metallic smell of the river. On a south-facing slope littered with granite scree, a man was engaged in a struggle that the rest of the valley considered pure madness. Andrei Pintilie, a Romanian immigrant with hands calloused from a lifetime of shaping stone, was wrestling with a ghost. It was the fallen husk of a cedar tree, a giant 7 feet in diameter, hollowed by a century of life and rot. He wasn't sawing it for lumber or splitting it for firewood. He was trying to lever it, inch by painful inch, against the sheer rock face of a low cliff. Wallace Crowder, the valley sawyer, rode up on his bay mare, reins loose in his hands. He ran the only sawmill for 30 miles, a business built on turning the valley's timber into straight, predictable board and batten cabins. He watched Pintilie strain against a peeled log used as a lever, his muscles cording. "Pintilie," Crowder called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man whose work defined the very shape of the community. "What in God's name are you building? A home for a bear?" Two other settlers, Jebediah Stone and Silas Blackwood, had stopped their wagon on the track below, drawn by the strange sight. They leaned against the wagon wheel, arms crossed. Andrei paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. He nodded a polite greeting. "A house, Mr. Crowder." Crowder spat a stream of tobacco juice near his horse's hoof. "A house? That's a rotten log, man. The heartwood's gone. It'll check and split before the first hard frost, and even if it doesn't, it's round. You can't build square from a round log without my saw, and you're not using it. It's foolish." Jebediah, a carpenter who prided himself on tight dovetails and plumb walls, chimed in. "He's right, Andrei. There's no sense to it. You'll have gaps a cat could walk through. It won't hold heat. It won't even hold its own shape." Andrei Pintilie simply looked from the hollowed cedar to the silent, sun-warmed cliff face behind it. "The wood is only the front," he said, his English still thick with the cadence of his homeland. "The stone is the house." Crowder shook his head, a wry smile playing on his lips as he turned to the others. He wasn't a malicious man, but he was a practical one, and this was an offense against practicality. More than that, it was an offense against his trade. A cabin that used no sawn lumber, no milled joists, no framing studs, was a cabin that starved the saw. It was a rejection of the established, hard-won knowledge of the valley. He watched Andrei go back to his lever, and the quiet, methodical work seemed only to amplify the absurdity. "Let the man have his folly," Crowder said, loud enough for Andrei to hear. "The winter will teach him a lesson our saws don't have to." The men chuckled, climbed back into their wagon, and rattled away, leaving Andrei alone with the cliff, the log, and an idea they couldn't possibly comprehend. They saw a crazy man building a flimsy shelter. They didn't see the centuries of knowledge guiding his hands. What did this Romanian cellar vault mason understand about thermal mass time lag that a valley full of expert wood builders, men who could raise a sturdy cabin in a week, had completely missed? The answer to that question would not only save his family, but it would fundamentally alter the way people survived in the brutal Montana winters. The story of Andrei Pintilie is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most advanced knowledge is not new, but ancient, and that the greatest innovations often look like madness to those who benefit from the status quo. If you believe in the power of quiet ingenuity and the satisfaction of seeing a good idea proven right, then subscribe to this channel. I promise you will learn not just about history, but about the timeless physics of survival. Let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional but effective solution to a problem you've ever witnessed? Andrei Pintilie was not a carpenter. He was not a logger or a frontiersman. He was a mason, a shaper of stone and earth, a man whose trade was rooted in the soil of the old world, not the timber of the new. His hands understood the heft of granite, the curve of a barrel vault, the slow, patient work of fitting stone to stone in the subterranean quiet of a wine cellar. In Romania, he had carved cellars from the living hillsides, creating cool, stable environments that held their temperature year-round. He knew how to read the grain in a rock, how to find its weaknesses, and how to use its immense, silent strength. His signature skill was the hearth niche, a small fireplace carved directly into the rock wall of a cellar, a feature that allowed for the slow curing of meats and cheeses without smoke or fuss. He didn't think in terms of walls and roofs, he thought in terms of mass and time. He had arrived in the Bitterroot Valley 2 years prior with his wife Elena and their 2 small children, Mihai and Anna. Like every other settler, he bought lumber from Wallace Crowder's mill and built a standard cabin, a tight-looking box of pine boards and battens. He did the work well, chinking every seam with mud and grass, fitting the door and windows as snugly as he could. It looked like every other home in the valley, and it failed just as spectacularly. That first winter had been a brutal education. It wasn't the howling blizzards that were the worst, but the deep, relentless, cold snaps that followed. In the dead of night, the nails in the plank walls would sing, a high, metallic pinging sound as the wood shrank in the frigid air, pulling away from the metal. In the mornings, Elena would try to pour molasses for the children's oatmeal, but it wouldn't pour until the jar had sat by the fire for an hour. The blankets on their beds would be stiff where their breath had crossed the fabric, frozen into a delicate, icy lacework. They burned through a cord of wood every 10 days, a furious, constant battle of feeding the stove only to feel the heat vanish into the thin walls and drafty corners. Andrei had spent that winter watching the fire, not for its warmth, but for what it was telling him. It was a frantic, inefficient thing, a desperate shout against a vast, cold silence. The heat it produced was temporary, fleeting. It heated the air, but the air was a leaky vessel constantly escaping. The cabin itself, the very structure meant to hold the warmth, remained cold to the touch. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the house. The frontier builders, for all their skill, had mastered the art of building a shell, but they had forgotten how to build a core. A wooden cabin is an insulator, and a decent one at that. Wood has a respectable R value, meaning it resists the transfer of heat. But it has very low thermal mass. It cannot store significant amounts of heat energy. 1,000 pounds of pine has the same thermal mass as about 300 pounds of stone. This is the critical distinction Andrei understood from his work with cellars. Heating a traditional cabin was like trying to fill a sieve with water. The heat poured in from the stove and immediately poured out through the walls, the roof, and the floor. The moment the fire died down, the temperature inside plummeted, chasing the temperature outside. The settlers were in a constant, fuel-intensive war against equilibrium, a war they could never win, only postpone. Andrei's neighbors suffered the same fate. They stuffed rags in cracks, nailed extra tar paper to the walls, and huddled closer to their ravenous stoves, all treating the symptom, drafts, while ignoring the disease, the fundamental lack of thermal mass. Andrei knew he couldn't fight the Montana winter. He had to partner with it. He needed a battery, a place to store the heat from his fire so it could be released slowly, evenly, through the coldest hours of the night. He needed a mountain, or failing that, a small piece of one. The build began not with an axe, but with a shovel and a rock hammer. For a week, Andrei did nothing but study the low cliff at the back of his parcel of land. It was south-facing, a crucial detail. It soaked in the low winter sun all day. He found a section of solid granite gneiss, a dense, ancient rock that felt solid under his hammer. Then he began his search for the second component. He didn't go to the sawmill. He walked the forest, looking for not a straight, healthy tree, but a fallen casualty. He found it a quarter-mile up the slope, a massive western red cedar, toppled by a windstorm years ago. Critically, it was hollow. A lightning strike or fungal rot had consumed its heartwood, leaving behind a thick, intact shell of decay-resistant cedar. It was 7 feet thick at its base. To Wallace Crowder, it was useless refuse. To Andrei, it was the front wall of his house, delivered by nature. Moving it was a monumental task. He spent 2 weeks with levers, log rollers, and a block and tackle hitched to his bewildered mule, slowly, painstakingly coaxing the enormous hollow log down the slope and into position against the prepared rock face. The mockery from his neighbors was constant. They saw a man wrestling with garbage. He saw a man positioning a pre-built, insulated wall. Once the log was flush against the cliff, the real work, the mason's work, began. He didn't try to flatten the rock. He scribed the contours of the cliff onto the back of the hollow log with a piece of charcoal, then painstakingly carved the cedar with an adze and draw knife until it fit against the stone like a key in a lock. The main structure was now in place, a half-cylinder of wood pressed against a flat wall of rock. He used the natural curve of the log to his advantage, building a low-profile sod roof that sloped from the top of the cliff down over the cedar shell, making the entire structure look like a natural feature of the hillside. Now came the hearth. Andrei didn't build a fireplace. He excavated one. Using his mason's hammers and chisels, he began carving directly into the cliff face at the back of the interior. This was the work he knew best. For days, the valley echoed with the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of steel on stone. He wasn't just making a hole. He was shaping a smoke chamber, a flue, and a firebox, following the principles of his Romanian cellar hearths. The flue wasn't a straight shot up. It was a gentle S-curve, carved inside the rock itself, designed to extract the maximum amount of heat from the smoke before it exited through a small, stone-capped opening high on the cliff face. Wallace Crowder stopped by again, this time with a more pointed objection. "Pintilie, I've been a sawyer in this valley for 20 years, he said, gesturing at the bizarre structure. "That hollow log is going to check right at the heart. That's where the stress is. You get a cold snap, and a crack will run right up the middle of your front door. It's unstable." Andrei ran a hand over the smooth, adzed interior of the cedar. "The heart is gone, Mr. Crowder. No heart, no check," he said simply, and returned to his work. Finally, he sealed every joint. He didn't use expensive mortar. He used the earth itself. He packed a mixture of clay, sand, and dried grasses into every gap between the cedar and the rock, between the roof and the walls, creating a thick, airtight, and breathable seal. He built a simple door and 2 small glassed windows into the front of the cedar shell. When he was done, it looked less like a cabin and more like a part of the landscape, a hobbit hole tucked into the Montana hillside. Elena, his wife, stood with her arms crossed, looking at the strange dwelling. "It is not a pretty house, Andrei," she said, her voice a mix of concern and trust. He just smiled. "It is not a house for looking at. It is a house for living in." To understand why Andrei's strange structure worked, you have to understand a fundamental concept of thermodynamics, the difference between insulation and thermal mass. Think of it this way. Insulation is like a good coat. It slows down the rate at which you lose body heat to the cold air. A wooden wall is a coat. It's effective, but it doesn't produce any heat of its own. If you stop producing body heat, the coat will eventually turn cold. Thermal mass, on the other hand, is like a stone that's been sitting in the sun. It absorbs energy, stores it, and then radiates it back out slowly over a long period. The cliff face at the back of Andrei's cabin was a massive thermal battery. The rock he had chosen, a dense granite gneiss, weighs about 165 pounds per cubic foot. A cubic foot of pine, by contrast, weighs about 25 pounds. That rock could hold vastly more heat energy, or BTUs, than the wood. When Andrei started a small, steady fire in the hearth niche, he was doing two things at once. First, he was heating the air in the cabin just like any other stove, but second, and far more importantly, he was charging his battery. The radiant heat from the fire poured directly into the rock wall. For the first few hours, the rock would feel cool to the touch as it soaked up thousands of BTUs, drawing the energy deep into its crystalline structure. This is the time lag. The heat doesn't just bounce off, it gets absorbed. After several hours, the rock face would become saturated with thermal energy. It would begin to radiate that heat back into the living space. Andrei had created a system where his back wall was now a giant, gentle, silent radiator. He could let the fire burn down to embers at bedtime, and the cliff would continue to release its stored warmth all through the night. While his neighbors' cabins were rapidly losing heat the moment their fires waned, Andrei's home was being warmed by a silent, invisible engine of stored heat. The temperature inside wouldn't swing wildly, it would remain stable, a gentle rise and a gentle fall, moderated by tons of rock. The hollow cedar log played a crucial role too. Cedar has excellent insulating properties, far better than pine. And because it was a massive, single piece, there were no seams for drafts. The thick sod roof added even more insulation. Andrei hadn't built a flimsy shelter. He had built a highly insulated shell around a massive thermal battery. He wasn't fighting the cold, he was managing energy. He used a small fire to deposit heat into the rock during the day, and the rock paid him back with interest during the night. It was a system of profound and simple elegance, born from an ancient understanding of the earth. That January, the weather turned. It wasn't a storm, but something worse. A stagnant mass of Arctic air descended on the Bitterroot Valley and refused to leave. For 12 straight days, the temperature never rose above 10 below zero, and at night it plunged to a merciless 29 below. A thick ice fog, born of the moisture from the river, pinned itself to the valley floor, coating every tree branch, every fence post, every nailhead with a thick, crystalline layer of rime ice. The air was dead still, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp crack of a tree limb surrendering to the cold. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a state of siege. Jebediah Stone's family lived in one room, the one with the stove, for the entire 12 days. The water bucket in the corner of the room 10 feet from the fire was a solid block of ice. They slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned. Silas Blackwood's youngest daughter developed a hacking cough that echoed in the cold, thin air. They burned through their winter wood supply at a terrifying rate. The men constantly outside in the brutal cold, sawing and splitting, their breath freezing on their beards. At Wallace Crowder's large, well-built house next to the mill, the office was a place of misery. The ink in his inkwell was a frozen lump. The tin of bootblack he kept on his desk was a solid puck of wax. When he tried to force his brush into it, the frozen bristles snapped. The big potbelly stove in the center of the room roared day and night, but the windows were opaque, with an inch of interior frost, and anyone who sat more than 5 feet from the stove felt the cold seeping into their bones. Crowder was burning the best, driest fir from his mill, and it was barely enough to keep the misery at bay. Meanwhile, in Andrei Pintilie's home, a different reality was unfolding. The small fire in the rock hearth burned steadily but modestly. Andrei fed it small logs every few hours, never letting it roar. The air inside was still and quiet. There were no drafts. The single-pane windows had a thin veil of frost at the edges, but the centers were clear. On a small shelf near the door, a tin of bootblack sat, its contents soft and yielding to the touch of a brush. Elena moved about the cabin in a simple wool dress, her hands busy with mending, not clasped together for warmth. Mihai and Anna played on a sheepskin rug on the floor. building a small castle of wood scraps. The back wall of the cabin, the living rock, was warm. Not hot, but a deep, penetrating, constant warmth that radiated through the small space. They were not just surviving the cold, they were living, comfortably and calmly, in the heart of it. The contrast was absolute. Outside, the world was frozen solid. Inside, life went on, undisturbed, heated by a mountain. On the 10th day of the cold snap, Wallace Crowder knew he had to check his timber stands. The extreme cold could damage the big cedars, and he needed to mark any potentially compromised trees for spring cutting. He saddled his horse, the leather stiff and creaking, and rode up the slope toward the high country. The going was brutal. The horse's breath plumed in the air, freezing instantly on its muzzle. The snow was deep and dry, squeaking like styrofoam under the hooves. His route took him past Andrei Pintilie's property. He saw the low, snow-covered mound of the roof and the wisp of smoke, thinner than his own, rising from the stone-capped flue. He shook his head, thinking of the poor family inside that foolish structure. He decided to continue up the slope above the cabin, to get a better vantage point. As he dismounted to lead his horse through a deep drift, his boot slipped on an ice-covered patch of rock. He threw out a gloved hand to steady himself, planting it firmly on the exposed cliff face, about 6 feet above where he knew Pintilie's hearth must be. He expected to feel a cold so intense it would bite through his thick leather glove. He expected the brutal, unforgiving chill of a rock at 29 degrees below zero. Instead, what he felt made him snatch his hand back in disbelief. It was warmth, not a searing heat, but a deep, gentle, unmistakable warmth radiating out of the solid rock. He stared at his glove, then pressed his palm back against the stone. It was real. In the middle of a frozen wilderness, in the heart of an Arctic outbreak, this piece of the mountain was alive with heat. For a long moment, Wallace Crowder, the man of sawmills and straight lines, of proven methods and practical lumber, stood silent. Everything he knew about building, about heat and cold and survival, was being contradicted by the feeling in the palm of his hand. He looked down at the humble structure, half log, half hill, and saw it for the first time not as a folly, but as a solution. He led his horse down to the front of the cabin and knocked on the simple plank door. Andrei opened it, and a wave of calm, stable warmth washed over Crowder, a stark contrast to the needle-sharp cold on his face. He stepped inside. He saw the children playing on the floor. He saw Elena sewing by the window. He saw the soft tin of bootblack on the shelf. His eyes went to the back wall, the great warm stone, and then to the small, gentle fire flickering in its niche. He looked at Andrei, whose face showed no triumph, only a quiet welcome. Crowder took off his glove and laid his bare hand flat against the rock wall. The warmth was deep and real. He finally understood. Andrei hadn't just built a shelter to keep the cold out. He had built a reservoir to hold the heat in. The sawyer, a man of loud machines and sharp blades, was humbled by the silent, patient wisdom of the stone. "You didn't build a cabin, Pintilie," Crowder said, his voice low with a new respect. "You built a hearth inside a mountain." The conversion of Wallace Crowder was as complete as it was sudden. When the cold snap broke, he didn't just admit he was wrong, he became the innovation's most powerful advocate. He started telling everyone who came to the mill about the Romanian's warm rock. He described the soft bootblack and the children playing on the floor. At first, people were skeptical, but Crowder's reputation was unassailable. If he said it worked, it worked. He began to help others apply the principle, even if they didn't have a convenient south-facing cliff. "The principle is the battery," he'd explain, tapping his finger on a plan sketched on a piece of scrap lumber. "You don't need Pintilie's cliff, you just need mass." That spring, Silas Blackwood, whose daughter had been so sick, built a new addition to his cabin. With Crowder's help, he built the back wall not of wood, but of stacked rubble, river stones and field stones packed tightly with a clay and straw mortar. The wall was 3 feet thick. Against it, he built a simple shed roof shell of rough-sawn lumber from Crowder's mill. It was a hybrid, a frontier adaptation of Andrei's core idea. That next winter, his wood consumption dropped by half, and his daughter's cough did not return. The idea spread like a slow, steady fire. By the spring of 1909, 8 cabins in the Bitterroot Valley had been built or retrofitted with a high-mass wall. Some used stacked stone, others used rammed earth. They all followed the same logic. A well-insulated, lightweight shell wrapped around a heavy, heat-absorbing core. Andrei Pintilie, when asked, shared his knowledge freely, never asking for payment. He would walk to a neighbor's property, study their land, and show them how to orient their home to the sun, how to shape a flue for maximum heat extraction, how to mix clay and sand for the best seal. He wasn't teaching them to build a strange round house. He was teaching them to see the earth not as something to be cleared, but as a building partner. What Andrei Pintilie had brought to the Montana frontier was a piece of ancient engineering that modern building science would only rediscover decades later. His home was, in essence, a passive solar design with a trombe wall, a thermal mass wall separated from the exterior by a glazing, in this case, the cedar shell. He had intuitively understood the principles of thermal lag, radiant heat, and the immense energy storage capacity of dense materials. While his contemporaries were focused on insulation alone, fighting a defensive battle against heat loss, Andrei was playing an offensive game of energy management. He was capturing and storing heat, creating a thermal flywheel that smoothed out the brutal temperature swings of the high mountain climate. Modern sustainable architecture, with its focus on passive heating and cooling, on using local materials and working with the environment, is built on the very same foundations that Andrei laid down with his hollow log and his patient stone carving. The story of the Romanian mason and his warm rock is more than just a tale of survival. It's a parable about the nature of knowledge. The settlers of the Bitterroot Valley were not ignorant. They were experts in their own right, masters of a specific kind of woodcraft perfected for their environment. But their expertise had become a form of blindness, preventing them from seeing a solution that lay right at their feet. Andrei's genius wasn't in inventing something new, it was in applying something ancient to a new problem. He saw the cliff not as an obstacle, but as a component. He saw the fallen, hollow log not as waste, but as a wall. He looked at the world with a mason's eyes, and so he saw possibilities the woodworkers could not. He didn't burn fuel against the night. He spent sunlight the rock had been saving for him. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of thermal physics and historical building as fascinating as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of forgotten innovators. And let us know in the comments, what modern technologies are just rediscoveries of ancient wisdom? We appreciate your support, which allows us to bring these incredible stories to light. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, while the technical principles and building techniques are based on real historical practices. The application of any building techniques should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.